They told her to serve lunch because she looked like just another quiet civilian, no rank, no ribbons, no reason to notice. But when she leaned forward to place a plate in front of General Rutherford, her sleeve shifted. And that's when everything changed. There, barely visible beneath the fabric, was a silver star, not just a medal, but a silent scream of bravery. In that moment, every officer in the room realized the woman carrying trays wasn't just staff. She was a Silver Star hero whose courage had saved lives under fire. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? And don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode will leave you absolutely speechless. Let's get started. It was still early that morning when Charlotte Hayes stepped onto the grounds of Crescent Point Military Base, the late September heat already thick in the Georgia air. Her white blouse clung to her back as she walked across the parking lot of Building 15, the one she'd reported to every weekday for nearly a year. The base stretched wide around her beige buildings, uniformed figures marching by, everything so perfectly in order, everything but her place in it. Charlotte wasn't military anymore. She was just Ms. Hayes, a civilian admin in food logistics, someone who handled spreadsheets, vendor calls, and dining schedules for officers who never looked her in the eye. That's how she liked it, mostly out of sight, out of mind. No one at Crescent Point knew who she used to be. No one asked, and she never offered. She came in, did her work, and left without a ripple. Her apartment in Oak Hollow was small and forgettable, just like she intended. But all of that, the silence, the hiding, the effort she put into being invisible would come crashing down that day. And it started the moment a young captain decided she looked like someone who could carry a tray. It started with a clipboard. Captain Ryan Caldwell walked into the Civilian Food Services office without knocking a habit he'd adopted like it was part of his uniform. He was the type you recognized: instantly polished boots, perfect posture, and the air of someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. "Ladies," he announced, glancing at Charlotte and her coworker Grace, "we need the dining hall ready 30 minutes early today. General Rutherford and General Whitmore are arriving ahead of schedule." Grace looked up from her computer, the lines on her brow tightening. "Sir, we're already at full staff for today's luncheon. We don't have any more servers." Captain Caldwell barely blinked. "Then improvise," he said. With a smirk that landed somewhere between careless and condescending, his eyes landed on Charlotte. "What about her?" Charlotte didn't flinch. She kept typing her report, eyes fixed on the monitor. She knew how this worked. The moment you made eye contact, you were tagged for something unpleasant. "Ms. Hayes handles coordination," Grace replied calmly. "She's not trained for food service." "How hard can it be?" Caldwell scoffed, as if refilling water glasses was a national security risk. "Just tell her to carry the plates and look presentable. These are 3-star generals, not your average lunch crowd." Charlotte sat in silence. She'd heard that tone before, not just from officers like Caldwell, but from people who assumed that logistics and service meant you had nothing to offer beyond what they could see. "Fine," she said at last, turning to face Grace. "I'll help. Just let me know what time they need me." 11:30, Caldwell replied, already walking away like the problem had solved itself. "And tell her to wear something decent. The generals don't need to see staff that look like they just rolled out of bed." Grace turned to Charlotte the moment he left. "You don't have to do that," she said, her voice low. "I can try calling in someone from the part-time list." Charlotte shook her head and began saving her work. "It's okay. I've served officers before." She didn't say how. She didn't say when. Grace probably thought she meant at a base kitchen or banquet hall. She had no idea that Charlotte once served meals out of the back of a Humvee under mortar fire. No clue that she'd planned emergency food routes in Kandahar with less than half the resources and twice the danger. At 11:15, Charlotte changed into the standard black slacks and white blouse issued to food service assistants. She tied her hair back in the mirror, staring at the reflection of a woman who had long since learned how to disappear in plain sight. The officers' club was a relic of the past dark wood walls, portraits of old commanders, and a chandelier that looked like it hadn't been dusted since the Gulf War. The table could seat 20. The silverware sparkled. The coffee smelled like authority. She took her place by the serving station as the officers began to arrive, some familiar by name only, others strangers altogether. They laughed and settled in like they owned the world. Maybe some of them did. Captain Caldwell looked unusually anxious. He hovered near the head of the table, straightening napkins and fiddling with flower arrangements. For all his earlier arrogance, the pressure of hosting generals was clearly getting to him. At precisely 11:45, the door opened and silence followed. General Malcolm Rutherford entered first compact, silver-haired, face lined with the kind of experience that came from decades in field command. Behind him came General Olivia Whitmore, tall, poised, and sharp-eyed, the type who didn't need to raise her voice to own a room. Charlotte moved with calm precision, laying out the salad plates. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She had learned long ago that invisibility was her strongest armor. And then it happened. As she leaned forward to place a plate in front of General Rutherford, the sleeve of her blouse shifted just slightly. For the briefest of moments, the edge of a ribbon glinted beneath the cuff, barely visible, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. The silver star. Rutherford's eyes narrowed. He froze mid-sentence, his gaze locking onto the ribbon as Charlotte moved to the next officer. His mind raced. He had written dozens of commendations. He'd pinned that medal onto men and women who'd bled for it. But never had he seen it on someone pouring coffee in a dining hall. He didn't say anything, not yet. He just watched, studied her, not the way Caldwell did, not with dismissal, but with the sharp tactical attention of someone trained to notice what others miss. By the time dessert was being prepped, he would break the silence, and with just one quiet question, everything Charlotte had buried for the last 18 months would begin to surface. Charlotte kept her movements smooth, unhurried, deliberate. The lunch proceeded like so many others, small talk about budgets, equipment, readiness metrics. She served the last of the salad without interruption, unaware of the quiet storm brewing 2 seats from the head of the table. General Rutherford, however, was no longer engaged in the conversation. He was watching her, not in the way someone notices a server refilling water, but in the way a seasoned soldier watches an unmarked path for IEDs. Charlotte returned to the serving station to prepare for the main course herb-roasted chicken, green beans, rice pilaf. She double-checked the timing with the kitchen, her back straight, her hands steady. But in her periphery, she could feel his eyes. When she approached Rutherford again, plate in hand, he spoke, not loudly, not to the room, just to her. "That's an interesting ribbon," he said quietly, eyes still on his silverware. "Where did you earn it?" Charlotte paused, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but internally. It hit like a mortar round. "I beg your pardon, sir," she replied, her voice calm, professional, rehearsed. Rutherford glanced up just enough to meet her eyes. The silver star. That's not something you pick up in supply drops. A breath caught in her throat. She hadn't meant to wear it. It was a mistake, a relic of a past she wasn't ready to erase but no longer wanted to display. She'd forgotten it was sewn on that particular blouse. "Afghanistan," she said quietly, placing his plate, 3 deployments. Around them, conversation continued, oblivious, the clink of forks, the rustle of napkins, but Rutherford heard none of it. "And your MOS?" he asked, almost gently. 68, Charlotte said, combat medic. That was all he needed. Combat medics weren't just medical personnel. They were warriors with trauma kits, trained to sprint toward chaos while everyone else was running the other way. He'd commanded hundreds of them in his time. He knew what it took to earn that medal. And she was serving lunch. Charlotte moved on, placing plates, topping off water, pretending the conversation hadn't happened. But Rutherford watched her go with growing anger, not at her, but at the institution that had failed her so profoundly. When dessert came, a young Lieutenant Foster, fresh out of West Point, waved Charlotte off. "No thanks," she said, barely glancing up. "Just coffee's fine." Rutherford noticed the way Charlotte's face didn't change, but her shoulders stiffened ever so slightly. That was a wound too, death by 1,000 dismissals. General Whitmore had been listening. She'd picked up on the undercurrent. When the talk turned to morale, she pounced. "Captain Caldwell," she said, slicing into her key lime pie. "How well is this base integrating civilian veterans into its support roles?" Caldwell blinked. "Ma'am, most of our civilian hires are doing well. They prefer structured work, stability over leadership." "Is that from a survey?" Whitmore asked. Her voice sharpened with something close to disbelief. "Informal conversations, ma'am." Rutherford turned to Whitmore. "Some veterans don't prefer support roles. Some are just never asked what they're capable of." He looked across the table at Charlotte. She was clearing salad plates now, her hands still and sure, as though she hadn't just been outed by a 3-star general. He turned back. That woman right there, Silver Star. 3 tours, combat medic, and she's serving chicken and pie. The room went silent. Lieutenant Foster lowered her fork. Caldwell's eyes widened. Colonel Davis, head of administrative operations, looked like he'd swallowed a stone. Charlotte froze for half a heartbeat but kept clearing plates. She'd lived through worse than this, than awkward stares and stunned silence. Whitmore spoke first. "Is that true?" Charlotte looked up, and for the first time that day, didn't try to hide. "Yes, ma'am." "And how long have you been in this role?" 8 months. "Did anyone ask for your service record when you were hired?" Charlotte shook her head. "It wasn't required. I filled the form, said I'd done logistics. That was enough." Colonel Davis cleared his throat. "We rely on HR screening, of course, but yes, perhaps we missed some things." Missed, as if her history had fallen behind a file cabinet. Then Whitmore, firm as ever, said what no one else had the courage to. "This is unacceptable." Captain Caldwell tried to recover. "Had I known?" Charlotte didn't let him finish. "You didn't ask, sir. You just needed someone to carry plates." The line wasn't bitter. It was clean, surgical, like everything she did. It was precise. That moment changed everything. Charlotte was no longer invisible. She was now at the center of a conversation about respect, recognition, and systemic failure. Her ribbon, once hidden, had cracked the shell of silence that surrounded her. But the fallout had only just begun, because the question now wasn't just why she was ignored, but how many more like her had slipped through the cracks. The shift in the room was almost physical. It was as if the air itself had thickened, slowed, caught between what everyone thought they knew and what had just been revealed. Officers who'd ignored Charlotte moments earlier were now stealing glances at her, trying to reconcile the quiet woman who served their meals with the reality of a decorated warfighter. Captain Caldwell sat rigid in his chair, suddenly very aware of the weight of his words from earlier. "Tell her to wear something decent." The words echoed in his head like a round fired in a closed room. Now he couldn't meet her eyes. But Charlotte wasn't looking for apologies. She stood by the wall, her hands folded neatly behind her back, the final coffee tray untouched at her side. For 8 months, she had been invisible, not because she was weak, not because she lacked confidence, but because she chose to be. She'd built a wall around herself made of silence and efficiency. But now the cracks were showing, and the officers at that table were staring through them. General Whitmore broke the silence first. "Ms. Hayes Charlotte," she corrected herself. "Would you mind joining us at the table for a moment?" Charlotte hesitated. She wasn't supposed to be at the table. That was the rule. Staff stayed behind the line, never stepped into the circle of rank and power. That line had kept her safe. But she nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She stepped forward, each footfall measured. The room seemed to tilt around her. Caldwell shifted in his seat. Lieutenant Foster swallowed hard. Colonel Davis adjusted his collar. Charlotte took the empty chair closest to General Rutherford, but not before he stood and pulled it out for her. It was a quiet act, but one that said everything. Rutherford leaned in slightly, his voice low. "I'd like to understand, Charlotte, how someone with your background ended up in this role." She inhaled slowly. then let the words come. Medical separation, orthopedic injuries, some hearing loss, PTSD, she said matter-of-factly. When I left the Army, I tried to apply for positions in the VA system, in hospitals, training centers, but I don't have a nursing license, and most employers didn't know how to evaluate my military medical credentials. She looked around the table, so I stopped trying to explain. I just applied for whatever would hire me. The simplicity of her words hit harder than any speech. Foster, who just days ago had confidently rattled off statistics about workplace preferences and generational values, now looked visibly shaken. I didn't realize it was that hard to translate military skills, Foster said. Charlotte looked at her, but not unkindly. It's not hard when someone tries to understand, but most don't. They see a veteran and either assume you're unstable, overqualified, or just inconvenient. Rutherford nodded slowly. So you came here. Because they needed a logistics admin, and I needed a job. Her voice didn't tremble. I've been coordinating officer meal planning and dining rosters ever since. Quiet work, predictable. And you didn't tell anyone about your service? Whitmore asked. Charlotte smiled faintly. You think people around here are used to listening to a woman in food services talk about helicopter medevacs under fire? The room was still. Colonel Davis cleared his throat. Ms. Hayes. I think no. I know we've failed you. The placement process should have asked about military history. Look deeper. You should have never been slotted into this role. Charlotte didn't reply with anger, only honesty. I didn't want a spotlight. I just wanted a chance to belong somewhere again. And that was it. The truth. The kind that settled into the room and stayed there. Rutherford leaned back, eyes narrowed, gears turning behind them. How many more are there, he asked aloud. How many veterans working in logistics, or janitorial, or groundskeeping, who've done more in combat zones than any of us know? Whitmore turned to Colonel Davis. I want a full personnel review. Every civilian hire from the last 5 years. Cross-reference with their service history. Yes, ma'am. Then Rutherford looked back to Charlotte. And what about you, he asked. If we had a role that actually used your background medical coordination, emergency readiness, would you want that? The question hung heavy in the air. Charlotte looked at her hands for a moment. Then she said, quietly, I think I'm ready to stop hiding. Whitmore gave a single nod. Then let's stop letting people like you disappear into the shadows. And just like that, the hierarchy shifted, not in titles or ranks, but in respect, in understanding, in finally seeing someone who had been in front of them all along. The luncheon ended late. No one cared. Caldwell didn't speak much after that. Neither did Lieutenant Foster, but they both left changed. And as Charlotte walked out of the officers' club, sunlight warming her back, she realized something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. She belonged again. 3 days later, Charlotte Hayes sat outside Colonel Nathaniel Grant's office in Building 9, the medical readiness wing of Crescent Point Base. The hallway was clean, sterile, and too quiet, with that familiar scent of antiseptic and fresh paint that never seemed to leave military medical facilities. She held a manila folder in her lap. It wasn't a resume, not really. It was a stripped-down summary of her military history, deployments, awards, and service notes, the kind she'd stopped handing out months ago, after a dozen employers told her, That's impressive, but do you have any civilian certifications? This time, she'd been asked specifically for it. Inside the office, voices murmured. Then the door opened and Colonel Grant stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, his white shirt sleeves rolled up, clipboard in hand. Miss Hayes, he said with a small smile. Charlotte, she replied, rising. Come on in. His office was tidy and bright, lined with maps, organizational charts, and a whiteboard covered in color-coded scribbles about evacuation protocols and medical supply rotations. We've reviewed your file, he began as they sat. General Rutherford personally sent it over. Charlotte blinked. She hadn't known that. Grant continued. He says you once coordinated casualty evacuation from a hot zone with no comms, limited air support, and 12 wounded under fire. Charlotte nodded. Yes, sir. Helmand Province, EFOB Calder, 2012. Is it true you treated all 12 before extraction? 11, she said softly. One didn't make it. The room was still for a beat. Well, he said finally, our emergency preparedness section is down 2 coordinators. We need someone who understands chaos, who can lead under pressure and isn't afraid to get their hands dirty. Charlotte didn't respond immediately. The words meant something different to her than to most. Chaos wasn't a spreadsheet error. It was blood and noise and triage decisions that would follow you for life. I'm not the same person I was during that deployment, she said carefully. I still deal with chronic pain, and the PTSD, it doesn't vanish. Grant nodded with understanding. We're not asking for perfection. We're asking for someone who's been there, who knows what failure feels like and does everything to prevent it. He slid a document across the desk. It was an offer. GS-12, Medical Readiness Coordinator, full benefits, leadership responsibilities, and most importantly, respect. Charlotte stared at it. 8 months ago, she'd been sorting paper napkin orders and chicken thigh inventory while captains barked at her without learning her name. Now, she was being invited to lead life-saving operations. You don't need to answer now, Grant added gently. Think about it. But I want you to know we see you. She nodded, eyes burning despite her efforts to stay composed. Thank you, sir. As she left his office, sunlight streamed in through the hallway windows. For the first time in nearly 2 years, Charlotte felt taller, not because the weight on her shoulders had disappeared, but because she'd stopped crouching beneath it. The next morning, she walked back into her old office. Grace looked up from her desk, eyes already red. You're leaving, aren't you? She asked. Charlotte offered a soft smile. I am. Grace stood up and pulled her into a hug before she could speak. I knew there was something about you. I just didn't know how deep it went. Charlotte chuckled through her nose. I tried to keep it buried. Well, you failed, Grace pulled back, wiping at her eyes, and I'm glad. Together. They boxed up Charlotte's files, her sticky notes, her little plastic organizer of tea bags. Grace paused when she pulled a photo from the drawer, a worn picture of a young Charlotte in uniform, her arms slung around 2 medics in dust-covered gear. One of them had a bandaged head, the other a grin too big for his face. You should put this on your new desk, Grace said. Charlotte looked at it for a long moment. Maybe I will. As she walked out of the building for the last time as a food service admin, her steps felt different. She wasn't slipping through the shadows anymore. She was walking into the light where she belonged, and this time she wouldn't hide her ribbon. Charlotte's new office wasn't large, but it overlooked the east side of Crescent Point's medical compound, a place alive with movement. Ambulances ran drills in the parking lot, medics huddled over whiteboards. Civilian contractors briefed base staff on inventory management and casualty protocols. It was chaos, and it was exactly where she belonged. Her first week as Medical Readiness Coordinator felt like stepping back into a familiar uniform after too long out of it. The acronyms came naturally. The tone of the radio chatter, the tight cadence of emergency reports. It was a language her body still remembered even when her mind had tried to forget. But this time, she wasn't just the one responding to orders. Now, she gave them. Set up triage zone 2 near the south loading dock. Request backup med supplies from sector 4. Rehearse blackout evacuation routes again. No shortcuts. She wasn't loud, and she didn't bark commands. But when Charlotte spoke, people listened. There was something in her voice, something earned, not given. A quiet authority that only came from leading under fire. One morning, a young medic named Sergeant Reed walked in with a clipboard and a hesitant look. Ma'am, he said, stumbling a bit, can I ask you something? Charlotte glanced up, gesturing for him to sit. Of course. I've been struggling to keep up. The pace, the pressure, sometimes I feel like I'm not cut out for this. Charlotte leaned back, folding her arms. She studied him the way she once studied battlefield wounds, looking for severity, for depth, for what might be hidden. "Did you think I wasn't scared out there?" she asked quietly. Reed blinked. "You?" I remember holding pressure on a chest wound while rounds hit the wall behind me. I thought I was going to die, not just once, dozens of times, but the fear wasn't a sign of weakness. It was proof I was human. She paused. "What matters is what you do with that fear." Reed nodded slowly, something softening in his posture. "Thanks, ma'am. I needed to hear that." After he left, Charlotte sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the empty chair across from her. She hadn't told him everything, not about the night she'd almost given up, or the one patient she couldn't save, but she'd told him the part he needed, the part that reminded her, you don't lose your strength when you admit you're scared, you find it. By the end of her first month, something strange began to happen. People she didn't know started knocking on her door, veterans from other departments, junior officers, admin staff. Some came with questions about logistics. Some came with resumes and frustration, looking for a second chance. But most came with something heavier, quiet confessions, long silences, trauma in search of understanding. And Charlotte gave them what she could: honesty, experience, space. She wasn't just coordinating drills anymore, she was coordinating hope. Word spread that the woman who used to serve lunch had once pulled wounded soldiers from burning vehicles, that she'd earned a silver star by holding a line no one else could, that she'd somehow ended up behind a food cart and now sat 2 doors down from the base commander. But the part they remembered most wasn't the medal. It was the way she listened. One afternoon, Lieutenant Amanda Foster arrived at her door, clipboard in hand, awkward and uncertain. "Ms. Hayes, Charlotte," she said, "do you have a few minutes?" Charlotte smiled. "Sure." Foster entered slowly. "I've been assigned to help develop new integration protocols for veterans transitioning into civilian roles. General Whitmore recommended you as a consultant." Charlotte raised an eyebrow, both amused and curious. "Me? Why?" Foster looked sheepish. "She said you've lived through everything we're trying to fix." Charlotte nodded. That sounded about right. For the next hour, they discussed the hiring process, evaluation gaps, and the language barriers between military service and civilian job listings. But at some point, the conversation turned personal. Foster looked down at her hands. "I underestimated you. That first day, the lunch. I thought you were just another support worker." "I was," Charlotte replied softly, "and I wasn't." Foster nodded slowly. "I'm trying to be better. That's all anyone can do." As the lieutenant stood to leave, Charlotte added something she hadn't shared with anyone since the transition. "You want to know the hardest part of going from the field to a desk job?" Foster turned back. "What?" "Losing the why." Foster frowned. The why. In the field, everything mattered. Every second, every choice. When I left, it all felt quieter, too quiet. Like nothing I did could ever matter like it used to. She looked out the window, watching a pair of medics jog across the compound with trauma kits. But then I realized, maybe the point isn't to find a new why. Maybe it's to carry the old one forward, to protect people differently, to build something that outlives the battlefield. Foster swallowed hard. "Thank you, Charlotte." And with that, she left. Charlotte stood for a while, hand resting lightly on the corner of her desk. She was still learning, still healing, but for the first time in years, she wasn't shrinking. She wasn't apologizing for her story. She was growing, and this time, it showed. 6 months later, Charlotte stood at the front of the very same officers' club where everything had started, but this time, she wasn't holding a tray of food. She was standing behind a podium. The room was packed, officers in full-dress uniform, medical staff in clean fatigues, civilian contractors with clipboards and curious expressions. A large banner hung behind her that read, "Veteran Voices from Service to Strength." General Olivia Whitmore had asked her personally to open the base's first ever Veteran Integration Summit, an event designed to rewrite how military bases recognized and reemployed former service members. Charlotte had resisted at first. "I'm not a speaker," she'd said. "I'm not polished. I'm not comfortable being the face of anything." But General Rutherford had looked her in the eye and said, "Charlotte, you already are." So here she was. She took a quiet breath, adjusted the mic, and looked out across the faces. Some curious, some skeptical, some waiting to be inspired, and then she began. "I used to serve lunch in this very room," she said, voice steady. "I was the one refilling your water glasses while you talked about policy and command structures. Most of you never knew my name, and that was by design. I didn't want to be seen." A pause. The room leaned in. "Before that, I was a combat medic. 3 tours in Afghanistan. I earned a Silver Star in Helmand for evacuating the wounded under fire. But none of that came up when I applied for a civilian job here. And no one asked." She let that hang. It wasn't accusation, it was truth. "I didn't speak up because I thought silence would protect me, because I was afraid my story would be too heavy, too much." She scanned the crowd. Some were already moved. A few blinked back emotion. "But here's what I've learned. Invisibility doesn't serve anyone. Not me. Not you. Not the young soldier who's leaving the service tomorrow and wondering if they'll ever matter again." Charlotte stepped out from behind the podium, holding a photo in her hand. The same one Grace had found months ago, her and her medics. Dusty, exhausted, alive. "This is my team," she said. "Some made it home, some didn't, but every single one of them gave everything they had and deserved more than to be forgotten when they took off the uniform." She looked back up. "I was given a second chance here, not just at a job, but at a purpose. And I promise you, there are thousands of Charlottes out there, men and women who led, served, sacrificed, and are now sorting boxes in supply rooms or answering phones at visitor gates." She stepped forward once more. "If we don't see them, if we don't fight to see them, then we lose something far more than personnel. We lose our legacy." Silence. Then a slow, rising applause. It began from the back of the room and surged forward until the entire hall was standing. Charlotte didn't smile for the praise. She smiled for what it meant. After the speech, people lined up to talk to her. Some shared their own stories, quiet struggles, moments of invisibility, dreams they'd buried. Others just thanked her, shaking her hand with reverence they hadn't offered when she wore the food service uniform. Lieutenant Foster was among the first to reach her. "I've started interviewing every civilian hire myself," she said. "Proud, no more assumptions. I ask about service records, not just resumes." Charlotte nodded. "Good. That's how change starts." Even Captain Caldwell approached, humbled. "I owe you an apology," he said, avoiding eye contact at first. "I judged you without ever trying to understand." Charlotte didn't make it easy for him. She let the silence stretch. Then, finally, she replied, "Most people did." He nodded, taking the hit. "You changed the way I lead, for the better, and that more than any medal meant everything." That night, Charlotte returned to her apartment in Oak Hollow, the same small space, but it didn't feel small anymore. She placed the framed photo of her old squad beside a new one, the summit banner with her name beneath it. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying years ago, on nights when grief and guilt crept in uninvited. But tonight wasn't for sorrow. Tonight was for pride. She walked to her tiny balcony, breathing in the cool spring air. In the distance, she could hear drills echoing from the base, a new class of recruits, perhaps, the cycle beginning again. Charlotte Hayes had been forgotten. Now she was a voice, a leader, a force for others. And somewhere out there, another veteran just like her would be seen because she dared to speak. The story of Charlotte Hayes reminds us that the measure of a person is never in their job title, their uniform, or their silence, but in what they've endured, overcome, and given to others. Charlotte didn't ask to be honored. She didn't demand attention. She simply showed up, day after day, doing her job with grace while hiding a past of unspeakable courage. When someone finally saw her, truly saw her, the world shifted. Not just for her, but for everyone like her who had been overlooked. The lesson: look closer, ask deeper, and never assume silence means insignificance. Because hidden among us are warriors, healers, leaders, people who've walked through fire and returned, quietly carrying wisdom that could light the way for others.